The Western Philosophy, Will Durant, Chapter 4, Section 2, Matter and Mind, page 188. But what is mind and what is matter? Is the mind material, as some unimaginative people suppose, or is the body merely an idea, as some imaginative people suppose? Is the mental process the cause or the effect of the cerebral process? Or are they, as Malebranche taught, unrelated and independent, and only providentially parallel? Neither is mind material, answers Spinoza, nor is matter mental. Neither is the brain process the cause, nor is it the effect of thought, nor are the two processes independent and parallel. So there are not two processes, and there are not two entities. There is but one process, seen now inwardly as thought, and now outwardly as motion. There is but one entity, seen now inwardly as mind, now outwardly as matter, but in reality and in inextricable mixture and the unity of both. Mind and body do not act upon each other because they are not other, they are one. The body cannot determine the mind to think, nor the mind determine the body to remain in motion or at rest, or in another state, for the simple reason that the decision of the mind and the desire and the determination of the body are one and the same thing. And all the world is unifiedly double in this way. Wherever there is an external material process, it is but one side or aspect of the real process, which to a fuller view would be seen to include as well an internal process correlative in however difficult a degree with the mental process which we see within ourselves. The inward and the mental process corresponds at every stage with the external and the material process. The order and the connection of ideas is the same as the order and the connection of things. Thinking substance and the extended substance are one and the same thing, comprehended now through this, now through that attribute or aspect. Certain of the Jews seem to have perceived this through confusedly, for they said that God and his intellect and the things conceived by this intellect were one and the same thing. If mind be taken in a large sense to correspond with the nervous system in all its ramifications, then every change in the body will be accompanied by, or better, form a whole with a correlative change in the mind. Just as thoughts and mental processes are connected and arranged in the mind, so in the body its modifications and the modifications of things affecting the body through sensations are arranged according to their order, and nothing can happen to the body which is not perceived by the mind and consciously or unconsciously felt. Just as the emotion is felt in part of a whole, of which changes in the circulatory and respiratory and digestive systems are the basis. So an idea is a part, along with the bodily changes, of one complex organic process. Even the infinitesimal subtleties of mathematical reflection have their correlate in the body. Have not the behaviorists proposed to detect a man's thoughts by recording those involuntary vibrations of the vocal cords that seem to accompany all thinking? After so trying to melt away the distinction between body and mind, Spinoza goes on to reduce to a question of degree the difference between intellect and will. There are no faculties in the mind, no separate entities called intellect or will, much less imagination or memory. The mind is not an agency that deals with ideas, but it is the ideas themselves in their process and concatenation. Intellect is merely an abstract and shorthand term for a series of ideas, and will an abstract term for a series of actions or volitions. The intellect and the will are related to this or that idea or volition as rockiness to this or that rock. Finally, will and intellect are one and the same thing, for a volition is merely an idea which, by richness of associations, or perhaps through the absence of competitive ideas, has remained long enough in consciousness to pass over into action. Every idea becomes an action unless stopped in the transition by a different idea. The idea is itself the first stage of a unified organic process, of which external action is the completion. What is often called will, as the impulsive force which determines the duration of an idea in consciousness, should be called desire, which is the very essence of man. Desire is an appetite or instinct of which we are conscious, but instincts need not always operate through conscious desire. Behind the instinct is the vague and varied effort for self-preservation. Conatus essic preservandi. Spinoza sees this in all human and even infrahuman activity, just as Schopenhauer and Nietzsche were to see the will to live or the will to power everywhere. Philosophers seldom disagree. Everything, insofar as it is in itself, endeavors to persist in its own being, and the endeavor wherewith a thing seeks to persist in its own being is nothing else than the actual essence of that thing. The power whereby a thing persists is the core individual, or as our solitary bachelor fails to add, the species or the group. Pleasure and pain are the satisfaction or the hindrance of an instinct. They are not the causes of our desires, but their results. We do not desire things because they give us pleasure, but they give us pleasure because we desire them. And we desire them because we must. There is, consequently, no free will. The necessities of survival determine instinct. Instinct determines desire, and desire determines thought and action. The decisions of the mind are nothing save desires, which vary according to various dispositions. There is in the mind no absolute or free will, but the mind is determined in willing this or that by a cause which is determined in its turn by another cause, and this by another, and so on to infinity. Men think themselves free because they are conscious of their volitions and desires, but are ignorant of the causes by which they are led to wish and desire. Spinoza compares the feeling of free will to a stone thinking as it travels through space, that it determines its own trajectory and selects the place and time of its fall. Since human actions obey laws and fixed as those of geometry, psychology should be studied in geometrical form and with mathematical objectivity. I will write about human beings as though I were concerned with lines and planes and solids. I have labored carefully not to mock, lament, or execrate, but to understand human action. And to this end I have looked upon passions not as vices of human nature, but as properties just as pertinent to it as are heat, cold, storm, thunder, and the like to the nature of the atmosphere. It is this impartiality of approach that gives to Spinoza's study of human nature such superiority that Durant called it the most complete by far which has ever been made by any moral philosopher. Time knew no better way of praising Bailey's analysis than to compare it with Spinoza's, while Johannes Müller, coming to the subject of the instinct and emotions, wrote, with regard to the relations of the passions to one another apart from their physiological conditions, it is impossible to give any better account than that which Spinoza has laid down with unsurpassed mastery, and the famous physiologist with the modesty which usually accompanies real greatness, went on to quote in extenso the third book of the Ethics. It is through that analysis of human conduct that Spinoza approaches at last the problems which give the title to his masterpiece. Section 3, Intellect and Morals. Ultimately, there are but three systems of ethics, three conceptions of the ideal character and the moral life. One is that of Buddha and Jesus, which stresses the feminine virtues, considers all men to be equally precious, resists evil only by returning good, identifies virtue with love, and inclines in politics to ultimate democracy. Another is the ethic of Machiavelli and Nietzsche, which stresses the masculine virtues, accepts the inequality of man, relishes the risks of combat and conquest and rule, identifies virtue with power, and exalts an hereditary aristocracy. A third, the ethic of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, denies the universal applicability of either the feminine or the masculine virtues, considers that only the informed and mature mind can judge according to diverse circumstances. When love should rule, and when power identifies virtue, therefore, with intelligence and advocates a varying mixture of aristocracy and democracy in government. It is the distinction of Spinoza that his ethic unconsciously reconciles these apparently hostile philosophies, weaves them into a harmonious unity, and gives us, in consequence, a system of morals which is the supreme achievement of modern thought. He begins by making happiness the goal of conduct, and he defines happiness very simply as the presence of pleasure and the absence of pain. But pleasure and pain are relative, not absolute, and they are not states, but transitions. Pleasure is man's transition from a lesser state of perfection, example, completeness or fulfillment, to a greater. Joy consists in this, that one's power is increased. Pain is man's transition from a greater state of perfection to a lesser. I see transition, for pleasure is not perfection itself. If a man were born with the perfection to which he passes, he would be without the emotion of pleasure. And the contrary of this makes it still more apparent. All passions are passages, all emotions are motions towards or from completeness and power. By emotion affect us, I understand the modification of the body by which the power of action in the body is increased or diminished, aided or restrained, and at the same time the ideas of these modifications. This theory of emotion is usually credited to James and Lang. It is here formulated more precisely than by either of a passion or an emotion is bad or good, not in itself. These psychologists and accords remarkably with the finding of Professor Cannon. A passion or an emotion is bad or good not in itself, but only as it decreases or enhances our power. By virtue and power, I mean the same thing. A virtue is a power of acting, a form of ability. The more a man can preserve his being and seek what is useful to him, the greater is his virtue. Spinoza does not ask a man to sacrifice himself to another's good. He is more lenient than nature. He thinks that egoism is a necessary corollary of the supreme instinct of self-preservation. No one ever neglects anything which he judges to be good, except with the hope of gaining a greater good. This seems to Spinoza perfectly reasonable. Since reason demands nothing against nature, it concedes that each man must love himself and seek what is useful to him and desire whatever leads him truly to a greater state of perfection, and that each man should endeavor to preserve his being so far as in him lies. So he builds his ethic not on altruism and the natural goodness of man, like utopian reformers, nor on selfishness and the natural wickedness of man, like cynical conservatives, but on what he considers to be an inevitable and justifiable egoism. A system of morals that teaches a man to be weak is worthless. The foundation of virtue is no other than the effort to maintain one's being, and man's happiness consists in the power of so doing. Like Nietzsche, Spinoza has not much use for humility. It is either the hypocrisy of a schemer or the timidity of a slave. It implies the absence of power, whereas to Spinoza all virtues are forms of ability and power. So is remorse a defect rather than a virtue. He who repents is twice unhappy and doubtfully weak, but he does not spend so much time as Nietzsche in inveighing against humility. For humility is very rare, and as Cicero said, even the philosophers who write books in its praise take care to put their names on the title page. One who despises himself is the nearest to a proud man, says Spinoza, putting in a sentence a pet theory of the psychoanalyst, that every conscious virtue is an effort to conceal or correct a secret vice. And whereas Spinoza dislikes humility, he admires modesty and objects to a pride that is not tenoned and mortised. Indeed, conceit makes man a nuisance to one another. The conceited man relates only his own great deeds and only the evil ones of others. He delights in the presence of his inferiors, who will gap at his perfections and exploits, and becomes at least the victim of those who praise him most. For none are more taken in by flattery than the proud. So far, our gentle philosopher offers us a rather Spartan ethic, but he strikes in other passages a softer tone. He marvels at the amount of envy, recrimination, mutual belittlement, and even hatred, which agitates and separates men, and sees no remedy for our social ills except in the elimination of these and similar emotions. He believes it is a simple matter to show that hatred, perhaps because it trembles on the verge of love, can be more easily overcome by love than by reciprocated hate. For hatred is fed on the feeling that it is returned, whereas he who believes himself to be loved by one whom he hates is a prey to the conflicting emotions of hatred and love, since, as Spinoza perhaps too optimistic believes, love tends to beget love, so that his hatred disintegrates and loses force. To hate is to acknowledge our inferiority and our fear. We do not hate a foe whom we are confident we can overcome. He who wishes to revenge injuries by reciprocal hatred will live in misery. But he who endeavors to drive away hatred by means of love fights with pleasure and confidence. He resists equally one or many men, and scarcely needs at all the help of fortune. Those whom he conquers yield joyfully. Minds are conquered not by arms, but by greatness of soul. In such passages, Spinoza sees something of the light which shone on the hills of Galilee. But the essence of his ethic is rather Greek than Christian. The endeavor to understand is the first and only basis of virtue. Nothing could be more simply and truly and thoroughly Socratic, for we are tossed about by external causes in many ways, and like waves drive by contrary wind, we wave and are unconscious of the issue and our fate. We think we are most ourselves when we are most passionate, whereas it is then we are most passive, caught in some ancestral torrent of impulse of feeling, and swept on to precipitate reaction, which meets only part of the situation, because without thought only part of a situation can be perceived. A passion is an inadequate idea. Thought is response delayed till every vital angle of a problem has aroused a correlative reaction, inherited or acquired. Only so is the idea adequate the response, or that it can be. The instincts are magnificent as a driving force, but dangerous as guides. For by what we may call the individualism of the instincts, each of them seeks its own fulfillment, regardless of the good of the whole personality. What havoc has come to men, for example, from uncontrolled greed, pugnacity, or lust, till such men have become but the appendages of the instinct that has mastered them. The emotions by which we are daily assailed have reference rather to some part of the body which is affected beyond the others, and so the emotions as a rule are in excess and detain the mind in the contemplation of one object so that it cannot think of others. But desire that arises from pleasure or pained object so that it cannot think of others. But desire that arises from pleasure or pain which has reference to one or certain parts of the body has no advantage to man as a whole. To be ourselves, we must complete ourselves. All this is, of course, the old philosophic distinction between reason and passion. But Spinoza adds vitally to Socrates and the Stoics. He knows that as passion without reason is blind, reason without passion is dead. An emotion can neither be hindered nor removed except by a contrary and stronger emotion. Instead of uselessly opposing reason to passion, a contest in which the more deeply rooted and ancestral element usually wins, he opposes reasonless passions to passions coordinated by reason, put into place by the total perspective of the situation. Thought should not lack the heat of desire, nor desire the light of thought. A passion ceases to be a passion as soon as we form a clear and distinct idea of it, and the mind is subject to passions in proportion to the number of adequate ideas which it has. All appetites are passions only so far as they arise from inadequate ideas. They are virtues when generated by adequate ideas, or intelligent behavior exampled, or reaction which meets the total situation is virtuous action. And in the end, there is no virtue but intelligence. Spinoza ethics flows from his metaphysics. Just as reason there lay in the perception of law in the chaotic flux of things, so here it lies in the establishment of law in the chaotic flux of desires. There it lay in seeing, here it lies in acting sub species eternitatis under the form of eternity. In making perception and action fit the eternal perspective of the whole, thought helps us to this larger view because it is aided by imagination, which presents to consciousness those distinct effects of present actions which could have no play upon reaction if reaction were thoughtlessly immediate. The great obstacle to intelligent behavior is the superior vividness of present sensations as compared with those projected memories which we call imagination. Insofar as the mind conceives a thing according to the dictates of reason, it will be equally affected whether the idea be of anything present, past, or future. By imagination and reason, we turn experience into foresight. We become the creator of our future and cease to be the slaves of our past. So we achieve the only freedom possible to man, the passivity of passion is human bondage. The action of reason is human liberty. Freedom is not from casual law or process, but from partial passion or impulse, and freedom not from passion, but from uncoordinated and uncompleted passion. We are free only where we know. To be a Superman is to be free not from the restraints of social justice and humanity, but from the individualism of the instincts. With this completeness and integrity comes the equanimity of the wise man, not the aristocratic self-complacency of Aristotle's hero, much less the supercilious superiority of Nietzsche's ideal, but a more comradely poise and peace of mind. Men who are good by reason, example, men who under the guidance of reason seek what is useful to them, desire nothing for themselves which they do not also desire for the rest of mankind. To be great is not to be placed above humanity, ruling others, but to stand above by partialities and futilities of an informed desire, and to rule one's self. This is a nobler freedom than that which men call free will, for the will is not free, and perhaps there is no will. And let no one suppose that because he is no longer free, he is no longer morally responsible for his behavior and the structure of his life. Precisely because men's actions are determined by their memories, society must, for its protection, form its citizens through their hopes and fears into some measure of social order and cooperation. All education presupposes determinism and pours into the open mind of youth a store of prohibitions which are expected to participate in determining conduct. The evil which ensues from evil deeds is not therefore less to be feared because it comes of necessity. Whether our actions are free or not, our motives still are hope and fear. Therefore, the assertion is false that I would leave no room for precepts and commands. On the contrary, determinism makes for a better moral life. It teaches us not to despise or ridicule anyone or be angry with anyone. Men are not guilty, and though we punish miscreants, it will be without hate. We forgive them because they know not what they do. Above all, determinism fortifies us to expect and to beat both phases of fortune with an equal mind. We remember that all things follow by the eternal decrees of God. Perhaps even it will teach us the intellectual love of God, whereby we shall accept laws of nature gladly and find our fulfillment within her limitations. He who sees all things as determined cannot complain, though he may resist, for he perceives things under a certain species of eternity, and he understands that his mischances are not chances in the total scheme, that they find some justification in the external sequence and the structure of the world. So minded, he rises from the fitful pleasure of passion to the high serenity of contemplation, which sees all things as parts of an eternal order and development. He learns to smile in the face of the inevitable, and whether he comes into his own now or in 1,000 years, he sits content. He learns the old lesson that God is no capricious personality absorbed in the private affairs of his devotees, but the invariable sustaining order of the universe. Plato words the same conception beautifully in the Republic. He whose mind is fixed upon true being has no time to look down upon the little affairs of men, or to be filled with jealousy and enmity in the struggle against them. His eye is ever directed towards fixed and immutable principles, which he sees neither injuring nor injured by one another, but all in order, moving according to reason. These he imitates, and to these he would, so as far as he can, conform himself. That which is necessary, says Nietzsche, does not offend me. A more fatigue, love of fate, is the core of my nature, or Keats. To bear all naked truths, and no envisage circumstance or come, that is the top of sovereignty. Such a philosophy teaches us to say yea to life, and even to death. A free man thinks of nothing less than of death, and his wisdom is meditation not on death but on life. It calms our fretted egos with its large perspective. It reconciles us to the limitations within which our purposes must be circumscribed. It may lead to resignation and an orientally supine passivity, but it is also the indispensable basis of all wisdom and all strength. The part is over.